with that out of the way, thank you. So with that out of the way, what's today's webinar all about, and what's the grade model all about? So I think all of us in attendance today understand just how critical many developing countries' financing for development challenges are. Record high levels of debt and debt service, high and rising borrowing costs. We've unfortunately also seen sharp reductions in aid recently from several major donor countries. Climate finance commitments are not being met despite climate change increasing the cost of development. And we also know that countries in the global south continue to be exposed to widespread tax abuses, predominantly by multinational corporations. So all these pressures are eroding countries' fiscal space and impact on their abilities to finance and make progress towards the SDGs. But what if much more financing could be made available, perhaps by reducing debt service to more affordable levels, reducing tax abuses, minimizing tax exemptions, or by increasing climate finance? What realistically would be the impact on development outcomes in the SDGs in developing countries? Can we really know and answer that question? So researchers at the universities of St Andrews and Leicester set out to answer that question precisely and have developed the grade model in response. The grade model essentially shows how increases in government revenue realistically translate into different development impacts, given different development levels and governance conditions in a country. Basically, the same increase in revenues will have a different impact on the SDGs in different countries. Intuitively, we all know that. It sounds obvious, but grade represents a very robust and credible way to actually model this. So the objectives of today's webinar on the grade model are broadly twofold. So the first is to introduce colleagues to the grade model, how it works, what it shows, how the tool can be used to support research and advocacy. And secondly is that we want this tool to grow. We want colleagues to be involved in further shaping and expanding the tool so it can be made even more useful, relevant, and impactful. And hopefully we can build new partnerships and collaborations with different organizations on that journey along the way. So hopefully this short introduction has piqued your interest on the grade model. So let's find out more about it and meet our distinguished speakers today. So first of all, we're joined by Professor Stephen Hall, who's a professor of economics at the University of Leicester. He'll explain the econometric model sitting behind the tool. Second is Dr. Bernadette O'Hare, who's a reader in global health at the University of St Andrews in the UK. She'll show us how to use the tool, go through a few examples, and how its findings can be used to support advocacy. And then we have a few discussants who will join us as well. The first is Mr. Rob Floyd, who's Director of Innovation and Digital Policy at the African Centre for Economic Transformation, who will talk about how he's used the grade model in his work in Africa. Second, we're joined by Mr. Jamal Ibrahim at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who will talk about UNECA's work on IFFs in Africa. And then finally, Ms. Jenny La, who's an advisor with the TIA Collaborative and is one of our co-sponsors, will speak to some of the opportunities she sees to collaborate on this agenda moving forward. So without further ado, we have a great set of people joining us today. So Stephen, we'd love to hand it over to you and learn more about the grade model, what it's all about, and the econometric model that sits behind it. So over to you.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen, hopefully. Okay, well, my name is Stephen Hall. I'm a professor at the University of Leicester, and my real specialization is econometrics. So I'm responsible for the background to the grade model. Just lost my cursor somewhere. Oh, there it is. Oh, so what is the grade model? Government revenue and development estimations. The grade tool at St Andrews is what we think of as a visualization. That's something which is relatively easy to use. It can be used by almost anybody who's familiar with computers. And what it shows is how a change in government revenue per capita affects a whole range of the SDGs that we are normally very concerned about. It covers virtually every country in the world. It's an easy to use interactive tool, which is freely available at no cost to any of you. And I should say that we're happy to help users who are not too familiar with this tool to get into it and to come to understand exactly how to use it. Underlying the grade visualization, however, is a fairly sophisticated nonlinear econometric model. It's a panel data model, so it models every country in the world individually. It's based on data which starts in the 1990s up to the most recent data available. As I said, it's for almost every country in the world. And what it's essentially doing is to link government revenue and governance indicators to the SDGs. So if you allocate some money from, say, a profit shifted developed country into a developing country, it'll tell you how we think the various SDGs we cover will actually improve because of this reallocation of resources. The key thing behind the grade is this nonlinearity, and that's really fundamental in understanding why the grade is so effective in this area. This is what we call an S-shaped curve. It's actually a logistic curve in mathematical terms, and it's dominant in all sorts of areas of science. You can think of it in terms of how populations grow, how biological events occur, and in many other areas. And what it's actually saying is that for a long time, when things develop, you're at a very low level of coverage, and very little happens, even if you put some more resources into things, because there's so little development going on. But then, as you start to hit a growth phase, as development starts to really pick up, you get a period where there's very rapid returns to increased resources, government revenue, say, going into a developing country. And then you reach a plateau point, which is where most of the Western European countries are, where it's simply impossible to improve things further. So you might have, say, 100% coverage of electricity in a country, and putting more resources in simply cannot improve the coverage which goes on there. Now, this basic curve underlies all the different sectors of the grade model. This is just some actual data, so you can see it really does work like this. This is looking at the relationship between clean fuels and government revenue. You can see clearly there's a lower bound of 0, where countries don't use any clean fuels at all. As development increases and as government revenue increases, you reach a fairly rapid rising period. And then when you're at 100% of clean fuel use, you reach a plateau at the top. Now, most panel data models use linear equations to mimic this type of thing. And the big problem with that would be that obviously with higher government revenues, you could go above 100%. And with very low government revenues, you could easily fall below 0% in a linear context. But in the grade, we have this very strong nonlinearity behind almost all the relationships we look at, which captures what you can see, this real world piece of data. Technically, what we use is a logistic function, which you can see in the first equation there. If you like equations, that's a very standard logistic function, which simply shows this S-shaped curve going from a minimum value to a maximum value in a fairly smooth way. When you think of the picture of data I just showed you, however, you can see that the S-shaped curve is by no means unique to all countries, and it varies between countries quite a lot. So what we've done in the grade model is quite innovative. What we've added to the S-shaped curve is a set of extra variables, which are in the lower equation there. And those are the little W's inside the brackets. And what we use for this is a set of quality of governance indicators, so that we're saying that the actual quality of governance in a country can fundamentally affect the S-shaped curve. It can bring about the rapid period of development much quicker, or it can make the whole thing much flatter so that it takes a lot more resources to develop. The current coverage of the model includes a bunch of standard SDGs, the basic water, safe water, basic sanitation, safe sanitation, under 5 survival rate, maternal survival, a whole bunch of educational variables looking at primary school teacher ratios, etc. The use of clean fuels and the use of electricity and stunting in the population, as well as the 6 governance indicators, which are a fundamental part of the model. These are also endogenous inside the model, so we can show how increasing resources may actually improve the quality of governance, as well as at the same time directly improving the SDGs, which brings about a sort of virtuous circle. So that increasing governance improves the SDGs, and at the same time you get a natural increase in the SDGs from increased resources. Why does all this matter for advocacy? Well, this little table here is trying to make that clear. Before the outbreak of COVID, profits were being shifted from Nigeria to the Netherlands and running at around 689 million per year in 2019. And what we're asking here, those profits were being shifted essentially because the international financial system allows companies to move their profits to wherever is most effective for them. And the Netherlands charges a relatively low rate of corporation tax on profits shifted into the Netherlands. And so the question is, what would happen if that 689 million was actually given back to Nigeria and they were allowed to tax it themselves? The actual financial flows, of course, are exactly equal to each other. So if you are arguing as an advocate that you think money should go back to Nigeria because it's a poor country and needs that money for development, and you put that point to somebody in the Netherlands, they'd say, well, this is going to cost us roughly $689 million. Why should we do that? And while I think we all see the moral imperative to do that, the actual benefit in terms of just financial flows is not so obvious there. If we had a linear model, and we haven't actually created a linear model, but looking as a simple approximation, because a linear relationship is symmetric, when we start to look at the SDGs, it would be a similar cost to the Netherlands as the benefit to Nigeria. So we calculate roughly that if you move that amount of money into Nigeria from the Netherlands, it would avert the deaths of about 651 under 5 children per year. And if the model was linear, you'd find that that would probably cause a similar amount of deaths actually to occur in the Netherlands, because linear models are essentially symmetric. But what the grade model says is that moving that money from the Netherlands to Nigeria would avert 651 under 5 deaths every year in Nigeria, but the cost would be virtually zero to the Netherlands. There would be 0 deaths because the Netherlands, in terms of healthcare and child mortality, are at almost a perfect level, about as good as you can get. And so reducing their income by what's in national terms a relatively small amount would have 0 effect. And that's the great advantage we feel of advocacy in this situation. We also argue that this is a realistic model, and this is an important thing to understand about the grade system. In many advocacy cases, people argue that we should spend a certain amount of money on a certain activity, for instance, vaccinating children in a particular developing country, and they work out the cost of that. The problem with that is if you gave a developing country that amount of money, they simply wouldn't spend all that money on vaccinating children. They'd spread it around their budget, their general budget. And so that's an unrealistic assumption. Inside the grade, the assumption that we make is that when you give extra money in any form to a developing country, it's going to spend that money in the same proportions as it has historically. So we're not looking at one SDG improving as you get an increased amount of money coming into a country. We're looking at all the activities in that country improving. So all the SDGs we cover would improve, but also other things such as infrastructure building. And even if the country's spending a lot on military activity, that would increase too. So that's what we mean by a realistic model, one which doesn't make unrealistic assumptions about how a government will behave. And that is essentially my background to the grade model in terms of econometrics. So thank you for listening to me. And I'll pass you back to Gail now.
Thank you, Stephen. As you can see, Stephen and Bernadette as well are very much the brains behind this initiative. And I think the example that you gave of Nigeria and the Netherlands there was a really powerful one. So if colleagues have any thoughts about that, we'd very much welcome that. But Bernie, let me hand over to you now. Thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. Bernie, you run us through a few mock simulations on the website so we can understand what to do, how it works, and we can go away and have a play around with it ourselves. And we'd also love to hear more about how you've used it in your advocacy work as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Gail, and hello to everybody on the call. I'm delighted to see some very familiar names. So, how can we use the model that Stephen has developed for advocacy and possibly even policy making? And if we think this is just the S-shaped curve that we've mentioned, ideally we'd want everyone living in a country where there was 100% coverage of all of the SDGs. And of course, we know the SDGs are based on economic and social human rights. So we would love everyone to be living in those countries that have that. And how can we get there? And we need more government revenue in each country per person. And lots of people in this call have done amazing work to try and make sure countries have more government revenue, either by encouraging collaboration at the international level or at the national level, looking for where governments could increase their revenue. And this is where we think, and this is what we're proposing, is that the grade tool might help your advocacy work to bring the big numbers, but also the numbers of people who are actually impacted to the decision makers and say, this is what this extra money could buy. Even one extra child going to school is very important. So I'll just briefly show you the tool, and this is our website, and the model is on this tab. And if you click on this icon, you'll come to the model. And this is what the model looks like. I'm just going to try and make that smaller. So this shows all countries in the world. And on the left-hand panel, we have 4 panels. The first one allows us to select the country of interest. The
Bernie,
second,
I think we're still on the web page.
sorry, yeah.
Okay, just before you start doing the model.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Yeah. Are you seeing the
Perfect.
page?
That looks much better now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is what the model looks like. And on the left-hand side, there are 4 panels. The first one allows us to input the country that we're interested in. The next panel allows us to input the revenue, and I use secondary sources, of course, and it comes in many forms. It could be in terms of absolute additional revenue, $100 million. It could be additional revenue per capita, or as a percentage of government revenue. Or indeed, if we have a large data set, we can upload it as a CSV file. But for today, I'll just talk about single country estimates. Once we've decided, say we've decided on our revenue, we decide whether it's in dollars, millions, or billions of dollars, and this is in 2015 constant US dollars. We then select our projection period, and of course we're all now focused on the end of the SDGs, so I'll pick the 10 years before them, 2021 to 2030, and this is our outcome. We select the outcome of interest. So if we choose, for example, a low-income country, and the greyed out countries are not low income, those with colour on them are low income, and I'm going to pick Mali. So imagine if Mali, for whatever reason, from whatever source, had additional revenue, and we'll put it in as an increase in percentage of government revenue per capita. Just imagine if they had an increase of 20% of government revenue per capita, and we're still on basic sanitation. Almost 1 million people would have access to basic sanitation in the country. Almost 250,000 women would have access. Additional people would have access by 2030, and 160 children under 60,000 children under 5. So we see that the numbers are very impressive and just might influence someone who's making a decision. What about basic water? Equally very large numbers and impressive. We can also select to present multiple indicators, and these are the numbers by 2030. This is the numbers of people who would have access to those SDGs. We can download the image as a PNG, or we can download the plot data and present it as works for your presentation. What if we pick a lower middle income country, and I'm going to choose Pakistan. And again, we see the numbers are huge. Multiple indicators, clean fuels, 20 million. Let's look at one of them individually, and we look at under 5 mortality. And over 10 years, is the cumulative effect would be 120,000 children's lives saved. In 1 year, in the 2030, it would be just over 14,000 lives. So these are massive impacts that we can show decision makers to try and make our case for whatever policy change that we're hoping we're advocating for. Can you see my PowerPoint now, Gail?
No, we're still on the website, Bernie, so.
And, yeah. Second, sorry. Can you see a PowerPoint?
Now we can, yes, thank you.
So I'm going to just tell you a story and to show you how we, with colleagues, have used the model. And it's about Ireland. And in 2011, 2012, Ireland decided that they would like to sign tax treaties with a number of African countries to increase trade with African countries. And one of those countries that was selected was Ghana. And in 2018, Ireland approached Ghana, and the countries signed a tax treaty. And later in the same year, Ireland ratified it. As far as I know, it hasn't been ratified in Ghana yet. But in 2020, a group of NGOs, including NGOs from Ireland and from Ghana, were concerned about this, and this catalysed a submission to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. And they wrote in that submission, Ireland is failing to meet its obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child due to its facilitation of cross-border tax abuse. And they used the GRADE tool in this case to look at the impact of the estimates on tax abuse in Ghana at that stage. And the story, of course, doesn't stop there. The committee then, in their list of issues prior to reporting, asked Ireland to describe the measures taken to ensure that the tax policies don't contribute to tax abuse by companies operating in other countries, which might lead to a negative impact on the realisation of children's rights. And Ireland responded in their response. They said, we've done a spillover analysis. We don't believe there's any problem with our tax policies with regards to human rights in other countries. And the same NGOs resubmitted again, and they provided a critique of the spillover analysis, saying that it was narrow in focus in terms of the number of the countries, in terms of the number of years. And again used our tool to provide estimates of Ireland's contribution to tax abuse, the impact of tax abuse globally, using the Tax Justice Network estimates. And it was found that there'd be a vast number of children's lives impacted by their tax policies. And as a result, the convention then, in their concluding observations in 2023, asked Ireland to ensure that its tax policies don't contribute to tax abuse by companies registered in Ireland but operating in other countries, which might lead to a negative impact on the availability of resources for the realisation of children's rights. And this is not the end of the story. And just when some of the committee members who made the submission said that the committee members were very interested in the numbers. The actual evidence helped sway them to come to this conclusion. So this research was critical for that. So it might just persuade some decision makers in some places to make different decisions. And this isn't the end of the story. In 2024, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission took a very unusual step of also raising the issue of Irish tax policies with respect to their extraterritorial obligations and their impact on human rights in other countries, and again asked for an ongoing and independent analysis. And ourselves in the Tax Justice Network also admitted to the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, and the committee also asked Ireland to strengthen measures to combat cross-border tax evasion, to contribute to the international efforts to ensure everyone has 100% access to the SDGs, or economic and social cultural rights. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll hand back to you now, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernie. And I think many of us on the call will be dying to go to the website now and have a play around with it and see what findings we can unearth for our own countries or the countries that we work with. Incredibly powerful tool, I think, especially in a context. I think the examples of Mali and Pakistan that you raised there, showing just how large an impact even relatively modest increase in revenues can have from whatever source, and especially in a context in which the SDGs are severely behind, and the UN Secretary General's called for an SDG stimulus of 500 billion a year. I mean, I think this acts as a powerful impetus to say, come on, let's get there. Look what this can really achieve. Thanks for telling us about the impact of this work on your advocacy in Ireland and Ghana and the relationship there. I'd now like to hand over to Rob Floyd, because I know you've also used the grade model in your advocacy, also in Ghana, but I think elsewhere in Africa as well. So we'd love to hear more about your interactions with the grade tool, how you've used it, how impactful it is, and any suggestions for us as a grade team going forward in how we can further develop, expand this tool as we go forward as well. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Gail, and thanks, Bernie and Stephen. Sorry, it looks like I'm sitting in the dark. I'm actually at Ashesi University in Ghana, sitting outside under a cover, but it's getting dark and starting to rain, so I don't have a light to turn on. But thank you very much. I mean, just a little bit of context. So, with Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, announced the reform of the World Bank and MDBs, and that kicked off a whole series of work around global financial architecture reforms. A number of African ministers of finance approached ASEP and some other partners and asked for our help because they didn't have the answers around some of the complicated global financial reform architecture, and to be honest, didn't understand all of the issues. And in many cases, think tanks in their countries, which focus more on national issues, also were not conversant in those issues. One of the things that we wanted to do at that time was to look at various global financial architecture reforms and what the impact might be on humans, what the human cost of existing financial architecture is. So we were looking around, and we were wonderfully happy when we found GRADE, and even more happy when we realized we could have a wonderful partnership and collaboration, and so it's been really great. We have to date run 2,476 individual simulations over 8 areas, including global wealth tax, the impact of improved credit ratings, the potential for improved Africa Development Fund contributions. That's the equivalent of IDA for the African Development Bank, of the reallocation of special drawing rights, which has been one of the calls for action under the global financial architecture reforms, debt service. We also looked at improved domestic resource mobilization, so not only global financial reforms, but reforms within African countries, climate finance, and then a specific one on debt restructuring for Ghana related to the Euro bonds. And so other than that last one, we've run them for all of the countries that are all the African nations that are available within GRADE. And what we've done is used this as part of our advocacy toolkit, if you will. So we're very happy to say that in one instance, we had an African head of state that came to us asking for some briefing material, and we were able to provide inputs there. In another instance, it went to a briefing for a G7 Minister of Development. It's gone into numerous speeches, inputs to ministers of finance, etc. So it's been a very useful tool for us. What we hope is that it, on the one hand, gives African policymakers firepower, right? That they will actually use this data to make their arguments based in, and Stephen's points are extraordinarily important here. One is that it takes into account the governance factors, right? So this is, and the second, which is related, is that these are realistic, right? These are not pie in the sky number, linear based numbers, etc., that we sometimes see from advocacy organizations, which then make it very difficult for policymakers to use that data because it's not as credible as it might be in other cases. But we also want to use it to help spur action, right, in the international community and among African governments. So we are in the process. We've engaged a communications firm, and we are preparing to roll out a public advocacy campaign. This will be a social media campaign and so forth, using a large amount of this data, and then also looking at developing kind of a chapeau document, a policy brief type document. So this has been extraordinarily useful for us, and I think for African policymakers, to ensure that we have, again, realistic data. It's great that it covers many countries. I mean, this is the challenge that we often face, is the data isn't available for, is available for some countries, not for others, and so forth. It doesn't cover all African countries, but it covers many. As far as, improvements and so forth, needless to say, the more SDGs that one can cover, the better. It was great to have the clean energy indicator added relatively recently. That's great, but of course, the more that we can have available, the better. So I'll leave it there, but it's been a great experience. My colleague Frank Adu, I think, is on the call. He was actually the brain behind actually running all the simulations. So if people have specific questions about using the model and some of the statistical, there were some challenges, of course, as we got into this. It's a relatively complicated model, so I think it's isn't. Some people may have challenges in using it if they're not used to using those kind of models, but Frank is here if there's questions on that as well. But thank you very much, and again, we really appreciate the collaboration with both Leicester and St. Andrews. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That's really great to hear that the model has been useful in your interactions with African policymakers. Well noted on the need for more SDGs. I think that's something we'd definitely like to do. Thanks also for mentioning SDRs. I didn't mention that in my opening remarks about new potential sources of revenue, but absolutely, you're right to say that's been a consistent call from civil society and some governments, especially in the context of the FFD4, the Financing for Development Conference, which will take place just in a couple of weeks in Spain. I'm really pleased at this point. We're still on the topic of Africa, so to turn over to our colleague and good friend at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Jamal Ibrahim. I mean, these issues, illicit financial flows, tax, domestic resource mobilization, debt management, these are all important issues for your work. We'd love to hear more about what you're doing in these areas and perhaps how GRADE can support your research, your analysis, and your interactions with policymakers. Over to you, Jamal.
Thank you very much, Gail. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. No, this is first, I'm really delighted to be part of this. This is at the heart of what we do. I work in the section that looks at both economic governance and public finance. So we look at issues of tax, debt, and illicit financial flows and so, but it's also very timely for us at the ECA. At this time, because we co-lead the high-level working group on governance architecture, and also with the African Union, we've been working on the position on FFD. We had regional consultations in November, where we had 34 countries actually on this. So this is really timely. But first, let me start by commending colleagues at the universities of St. Andrews and University of Leicester for building this, what I think, very, very useful tool. And I think this is, as I said, at the heart of our work. Why? If you allow me, because it fits well with the ECA perspective on development in Africa. We've been over the last decade and a half working with member states to help them bring in development planning back in. And we're really happy that probably most of the countries now, either they have a Ministry of Planning or planning commissions. And within this work, we also been working with them with a link between planning and finance. And in terms of integrated national financing framework, and also we have a dashboard called IPRT, Integrated Planning and Reporting Tool, which help countries to align their national development plans with the SDGs and Agenda 2063. So, and within this, domestic resource mobilization is as a center of the work. And we think, and Gail and colleagues, that in Montreal, probably more than 20 years ago, domestic resource mobilization was central to the work because of issues of ownership and sovereignty or so. But now I think it's a new normal. With the geopolitical tensions, we talked about declining debt, ODA, debts, etc. So this is why we emphasize, the work on this. And let me then probably just zoom in on two areas which I think they're very, very relevant in terms of the grade. First is the illicit financial flows. We were the secretariat of the high-level panel, people call it the Mbeki panel. And I remember the discussion there between 2011 and 2015 when we had the report. And I remember what President Mbeki said. He asked us for a headline number. And we came up with the 50 billion and so on. So, and in his words, he said, it doesn't matter, if it's 50 or 60 or whatever, but we need the number to see the development impact. And I think this is what the colleagues are doing here. You know, what impacts in terms of education and health or so, because the leakage. And remember when we started that work, and Gail, we met in Brazil in a joint event. You know, most of the people at that time, they were not familiar with illicit financial flows. They thought about it as capital flight. It was a problem of developing countries because of business environment, etc., etc. But we really wanted to know how much Africa is losing and how Africa is accredited to the next level. So, you know, I wish if we had that discussion by that time, so it would have enriched the high level panel report. The second area that I just want to highlight is our work on tax expenditures. We saw when we had our economic governance report, that there is a lot of work in terms of the, and that was also one of the recommendations of high-level panel. It's on the cost and benefits of these tax incentives. Well, we thought, let's look at the cost of tax incentives and try to measure them. We help countries now in terms of getting to the benchmark. We train about probably 13 countries now. And it's helped, you know, the last example is last week, is that the Ethiopian government revised their tax incentive directives. But in looking at this and the revenue forgone, and then compare that to education and health in the report. But I think here, by engaging with this, we can go one step further. Because, you know, the revenue forgone from the tax incentive, it doesn't mean that there are additional revenues. Yes, because, you know, some firms may respond by reducing or terminating their business. It has other impacts on other firms, reducing their taxes and so. And it is a question actually in my head in terms of how can we move that further, and probably we can have a, you know, further discussion, you know, with the colleagues there. It's about this because it's quite static, as I say. You know, we can have the money, the revenue for one, and then compare them there. But it will be more interesting in terms of looking at the more, you know, additional revenues and the impact. So these are just two areas which I think are very, very important for me. Let me commend the you know, the colleagues again for this. This is excellent work, and I think it's very, very relevant to African policymakers, and then we'll see what sort of engagements or whatever. I can't speak on behalf of ECA, but I think ECA can provide, you know, many platforms because we are the secretariat of the African Ministers of Finance. You know, we work with member states. We work closely with the African Union, FDB or so. So let me stop here and thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, thank you, Jamal. That's much appreciated. And we appreciate ECA's support today. I think you're right to mention the report, the high-level panel report of President Mbeki as being a real game changer for Africa 10 years ago. We really appreciate, I mean, this is the purpose of today's webinar, was very much to explore opportunities for new partnerships and collaboration. So working with you and the many platforms that you have with African Union and others, I think let's definitely look at that further. Jenny, last but not least, I'm aware of time, and I'd love to come to a few of the comments and questions we've had in the chat, but we'd love to hear from you, our co-sponsor. So please, over to you.
Yes, I'm glad you flagged time. I'll speed through and cut some things off. I will just briefly speak more from the perspective of funders. TAI is a donor collaborative of philanthropies that work on inclusive and participatory governance, including on fiscal policy issues, but also on climate and some other issues. And so, we were very pleased to be invited to co-sponsor this from the grade model team because of its inclusion of governance in a way that we hadn't seen before. So obviously we want to highlight the importance of governance in social and development outcomes. And we hope governance funders will take a look at this. But also we have a project called Fund Fiscal to promote funding and funder awareness about fiscal policy issues, especially transparency, participation, accountability, and inclusion around tax, public spending, and debt. And in the context of aid decreasing and the agreements around the financing for development process, we think a model like this can again highlight the importance of public finance and government revenues, both from the domestic resource mobilization side, but also from the international side. And I saw in the chat somebody mentioned the UN conversations about a new framework convention on international tax cooperation, which is something that TAI watches and helps inform funders that are working on tax on. So again, important highlight for public finance, for governance. And then I'll just add that I think it shows opportunities around cross-sectoral thinking as it includes education, health, sanitation, and clean energy use, among others. All too often, many funders, have a specific sector, look at very proximate incomes, and this helps connect this both to broader macro issues in public finance, but also highlights how actually increases of government revenues overall can be good for multiple sectors. I'll just stop there, Gail, since we're short on time. And thank you all thanks to all the panelists for their wonderful presentation.
No, thank you, Jenny. We're really pleased to co-sponsor with the TAI collaborative. So we really appreciate your support for this webinar. And thank you for being a cheerleader for public finance. We need to roll back the prevailing narrative that private finance is going to come in and fill the financing gap, because I think many of us appreciate that's not true. I've seen a few comments come into the chat and a few questions as well. So thank you to those that have posted them. Before I go into those, just to say that the grade model website that Bernie showed you is open access and free to use. So please just go there and have a play with it. And please be in touch with the team, send your feedback, any questions or suggestions you might have. I know the team would really appreciate those. So a few comments that it's been very useful for advocacy in social media, engagement with policymakers. That's great. So thank you for all of you that have said that. Perhaps a question for you, Stephen. How does the model incorporate shocks, if at all? So we assume that a country doesn't experience shocks, or is there any way that is looked at? And then a couple of questions on sort of the broader anti-corruption government effectiveness realm, and how perhaps investments in anti-corruption, in government effectiveness might change results and improve SDG indicators. So maybe that's one that you can take on, Bernie. So perhaps over to you on the shocks question, Stephen, and please keep any questions and comments coming, and we'll try and look at them.
Okay, thank you. There's two ways of thinking that question. In many econometric exercises, we introduce shocks as a way of understanding the policy analysis. That's not what we do in the grade model. In the grade model, we're looking at the relationship between government expenditure per capita and each of the SDGs given the governance indicators. So we don't incorporate shocks as such in the way that a lot of, say, VAR modeling does. But the reason for that is that when you're conducting a simulation exercise, which is what this essentially is, what you're saying is, what would be the actual the effect of increasing government revenue? Now, that's regardless of the shocks. So you can imagine that at 2 years after you're doing your experiment, some big shock comes along like COVID and makes everything worse. But that doesn't affect the relative increase which is coming about because of the extra government revenue. It may be that both of them will be declining, but the difference between the two is still the positive effect of the extra government revenue which has been made available. So in this type of simulation exercise, shocks are sort of irrelevant because we're not really interested in saying, in 5 years into the future, what shock's likely to hit the country. We're thinking of what's the relative improvement going to be over whatever happens in the future of giving a country extra revenue. And that's the key thing, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. Bernie, on government effectiveness, anti-corruption.
And I think the question I'm reading is from Soren on the scope of the current model to look at the impact of the resources into, the source countries. So, for example, into Ireland or into the UK, how does that impact it? And no, the model, we can't look at that, Soren. All we could do is, for example, we could look at the outflows from a high income country. But again, because most of them are, almost 100%, it doesn't show impressive numbers. But as we add more indicators, more SDGs, for example, the number of nurses per 1,000 patients, we will be able to see those impacts even in the high income countries. But in terms of the impact of financialization in wealthy countries, I mean, the book by Nicholas Shaxton springs to mind, and I know there's more recent academic research, but the model wouldn't be able to help with that.
Great, thanks, Bernie. One question which perhaps I can put to the grade team, can you tell us a little bit more about the sources of data that you use to underpin the model, where they're drawn from and how comprehensive they are?
Thanks very much, Gail. I'll answer that one. So for the government revenue, we use the UN-wider government revenue database. And up until 2023, they have updated that every year. And for our projections, Stephen has projected government revenue per capita into the future using the previous estimates. For GDP per capita, we use the World Development Indicator estimates, and we're using constant 2015 US dollars in the current version. For the governance indicators, the 6 governance indicators Stephen mentioned, we use the worldwide governance indicators from the World Bank, and they are updated every year, and we update usually at the end of the year when all the others have updated. We then update the grade on an annual basis, usually around October, using the new numbers. Some of our population data also comes from the UN population division. That it's not complete in the World Development Indicators.
Super, thanks, Bernie. That's very helpful, because I'm sure a few people, like, after the session will be like, oh, well, where does their information come from? A lot of positive comments in the chat. So thank you to everyone who said that they've appreciated, those who are familiar with the grade model and have used it in their work, have appreciated it so far. So that's fantastic to hear. We only have a minute or two left. Maybe we can run 1 or 2 minutes over, as we started a few minutes late. But if anyone would like to ask a question directly, please either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and go ahead. Please don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. It was all incredibly clear. Well, we've had some very positive comments. They keep coming in the chat, so thank you very much. Well, from our panelists, any further final reflections before I close today? If there's no participants that would like to say anything, Jenny. And
Just wanted to Yeah, just wanted to quickly add, because I forgot to say it, and perhaps this is an important point for many organizations that are looking for funding. A lot of funders like to see concrete estimates, very specific numbers. And often it's done by, consultants using questionable methods. So I think it's wonderful to have a analytically rigorous and literature-based model that organizations can use to give numbers behind, anticipated impacts of their work when they're talking to funders.
Super, thanks, Jenny. That's always good to know how things should be framed when we're engaging with these stakeholders. Stephen, the last word is over to you.
Thank you. I always like to have the last word. A number of the questions which have appeared have asked things like, could you handle illicit flows of funds? And I think it's important to understand exactly how we work, because if you take our work with the Tax Justice Network, for example, the Tax Justice Network work out what they think the inappropriate flows are, and then we put those into the grade. So if you have a group which is looking at illicit flows of funds, if they can estimate what their funds are, we can then work out what the effect of those funds will be on all the SDGs. So we don't work out the original financial flows. We take it from someone who's looking at, say, debt issues or tax issues or debt restructuring or whatever. They make their estimates of what these financial flows are, and we turn them into SDGs. So if you're asking, can we handle illicit flows, I put the question back to you. Can you tell us what the illicit flows are? And then we can tell you what the consequences are.
Super. Thanks for the clarification, Stephen. So look, the positive comments keep on coming, and we really appreciate them. All I can do today at this point is thank you all for your participation. Thank our speakers, our panelists sincerely, and our various organisers, the University of St Andrews and Leicester and the TAI Collaborative for making this possible. We would like this to be the first of a series of webinars that we'll organise over the course of the rest of the year. So we were thinking perhaps in the autumn, we'd do another one with a private sector focus and then a third one towards the end of the year. So please stay tuned for that, and also let us know if you might have any suggestions for topics that you might like us to cover. Please be in touch with our team. As Bernie said, we'd like to expand the number of indicators we're able to look at. Also, it was mentioned by Rob that would be useful. We would love to expand and grow this tool and make sure it's known, understood, and used by many more people so it can be as impactful as possible. So please reach out to us. We'd love to explore opportunities for collaboration. I think Bernie's put some contact information in the chat there. We appreciate your participation and your feedback today. So wishing you all an enjoyable rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and stay posted for more. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Kamal.
Bye.
Jenny.
Thank
Okay.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen.